I just want to make a comment about brilliance, which is the brilliance of a diamond, of course, is from the light, and it's reflected brilliance. It's not brilliance that comes from within. So what's so interesting about coming to a gathering like this and having a chance to talk with a few people beforehand, it's wonderful to begin to feel that everyone here has a certain contribution that they can make. Design is design up there is because I'm delighted to be part of this. Fashion is something that I've been sort of a wannabe to get into the fashion industry. I'm the only one in my family, I was telling Marianne earlier, that did not go into fashion and retail. My grandfather owned the first high-rise department store in Newark, New Jersey. My father was at Macy's for 42 years, ended up as vice chairman of the board. My mother was a buyer at Lord & Taylor's. My sister was a buyer in Lord & Taylor's. I don't know what happened, but I became an architect. But I do dress up. That's the one thing that I include the fashion with it. But we have a great deal to learn from other industries, other creative industries, and that's why it's so great to be here. The second thing is, and we try to remember this ourselves, is that creativity, this is Sir Ken Robinson, creativity is as important as literacy. How many people in here consider themselves the creative people? Can everyone else raise their hands too? What we find is that we marginalize our creativity all the time. Even those of us within the industry, we think, oh, we don't do that, or that's not something. There's a creative possibility in absolutely every act. Don't tell your accountant this, because that would not be very good, but everyone else besides the accountants, and they can on their own time, just not with your books, be creative. And thirdly, and this is David Schenk's book that I recommend to you, The Genius Within, we're asking the wrong question. When we typically look at the idea of intelligence, creativity, we say, how intelligent are you? But it really is, how are you intelligent? And there's so many different ways in which we contribute. Even within my own office, the talents that people have are very often squandered in ways that we don't realize. So we try to bring it into what we do. And here we go. I'm just one slide behind. Excuse me. Not looking at the monitor. And I'm sort of a product of that. What's in the circle here are all the people that were heroes to me starting back quite a long time ago. And it delights me to be able to have Roy Rogers and Karl Marx in the same circle. Probably guys who never got together, actually, ever. But throughout all of these, there are threads that I brought to my business now. In 1980, I was 32 years old. Met this guy. Well, I didn't really actually meet him, but I went to a museum that was largely empty, actually, at the time. This is Auguste Rodin. I went as a young architect. My wife said, we've got to live someplace else before we have children, which I thought was a terrible idea. What was I thinking? We ended up in Paris in 1980, and I thought I would be studying architecture, this and that. I started drawing architecture, and I realized very shortly that my books were filled with these images, and they were the faces of these gargoyles, mascarons they're called, that are in the buildings, and the sculpture that were all over the buildings. As you can see, there's the evidence of architecture that's part of it, so it's sculpture within architecture, but the sculpture itself is what was touching me, and particularly these faces that were witnessing hundreds of years, 1,000 years of life in Paris, from these buildings. And I was reminded and I started doing sculpture myself, reminded by my sculpture teacher in Paris of a circumstance that he went through when he was, an experience that he had when he was traveling in Greece. And he was going to visit Pompeii. And he was on the train and he fell asleep. And when he woke up, the train was sort of at the bottom of the loop around Pompeii, and he asked to be let out. And so he's let out all by himself and began to walk through Pompeii. Has anyone been to Pompeii? Well, back in those days, no one? Yes, there we go. Back in those days, they didn't have guided tours. and that was in the 1950s. And so he was left to walk through all alone, and he began to look at these ruins, and the shock to him was he recognized how these people lived. Even though everything was small and the streets were small and the scale was changed, the bodies were still around the breakfast table. And he found himself weeping as he walked through Pompeii, realizing that we are inextricably connected through thousands of years. So where I am in this presentation, by the way, is the previous one went all the way back to almost, well, prehistoric times. And to a certain extent, we do too. And we're sort of bridging the gap between that experience of humanity that we feel is in all of us that needs to be recalled, needs to be remembered. Nick is going to talk about the technology in the far end. We're sort of in between. Our buildings are highly technical, and yet we hark back to 40,000 years ago when people decorated their environments with all manner of things, mostly things that recalled who they were. They were to remember themselves to a certain degree. And it seems crazy that we have to remember ourselves, but what's interesting is, of course, is the reason why all of you are here today is that we do forget what's important. We get carried along with life, as do all of us, and somehow forget some of the most important things. What we try to do is reintroduce this into architecture such that we are reminded of things that we have forgotten. We have a great example of it right here. In the 1930s, this was probably the last great example of sculpture and architecture in the United States. And it's, of course, Rockefeller Center. And what happened was that as the architecture became more spare, the sculpture became more powerful. And Raymond Hood, who was the architect at the time, actually wanted to remove some of the sculptures. John D. Rockefeller refused. But he saw the sculpture becoming even more powerful than these spare buildings because they had so much to say. And this is Noguchi, Isamu Noguchi, who a great figurative sculptor. Very few people know that an enormous piece is on Rockefeller Center, integrated into the architecture. Well, I came back in 1981 wanting to do this. This was my passion project. And no one was interested in sculpture and architecture, as it turns out. I did not get that email. And I followed it irrespective of that. Of course, we had to start rather modestly. One of my first clients, a cartoonist, had an iconic image. We put it into his bookcase. Had the chance to do his summer house and had one of his characters reclining on the balcony going up, or the baluster going up to the second floor. Had a rock and roller who was a client of mine who did his house, and Robert Johnson was one of his favorites. So we began doing this very modestly at first, and then gradually became immodest about it. Fortunately, because clients were interested in it. This is Boston College, the School of Management, Neo-Gothic architecture, really called for sculpture. It wasn't a big leap to provide sculpture, but they'd never had any buildings built on that campus since 1925 that had sculpture put into the architecture, which is what we did. It's integrated into the structure of the architecture itself. In all of these, there's a narrative that we're trying to find. And I know that in fashion, and in fact, most creative endeavors, there is a certain narrative that you're linking to. You're, of course, linking to the narrative of who we are as human beings, which is extremely the most important connection that we can possibly have. But there are stories that we're telling, and of course, we only have to look to Ralph Lauren, who brought in an extraordinary opening in the advertisement of fashion through the stories that were being told, and of course, before that in Richard Avedon and others. The narratives that are in our buildings relate obviously to the meaning of the buildings. This is the Center for Information Technology in Norwalk, and what we brought into it and the lines of the architecture have within it the lines in this building have the sculpture within it. What that sculpture is a conversation about information technology. And the people within that conversation are not perhaps the ones that you would think of. They go back to, in the middle, Demosthenes, a conversation actually that we stretch back 5,000 years. This is opening a window to another world. There are mysteries all around us, which you're going to hear in the second session. There are mysteries all around us that are right in front of us. We are part of a narrative that goes back thousands of years. And in design of any kind, to enter into that narrative is to enrich it. Demosthenes is part of it. Fuxi is way back there. And if anyone knows who Fuxi is, that would be amazing. He was the one the legendary progenitor of the I Ching, which you know about, of course. Yeah, there we go. I know. The I Ching going back some 3,000 years practically before Christ. And on up to Alan Turing. Steve Jobs didn't appear. Bill Gates didn't appear. And the conversation of their words connected from one to the other. They were put together in different conversational groups throughout. And it opened the students to a whole different idea of what it is they were studying and why it is they were there, and putting them in that conversation that stretched way back in time, much further than they imagined. And in the schools that we do a lot of elementary schools as well as colleges. There's obviously a great opportunity. This is the Columbus School in New Haven, Connecticut. And the theme of this, of course, Columbus was an extraordinary figure. When this replaced a school that was already there, and the original school, the Columbus Academy, was the center of this Italian community. Go ahead 40, 50 years, and the community is no longer Italian, it's Latin American. They don't have quite the same feeling about Columbus, as it turns out, as the Italians did. So Columbus was not so meaningful for them, actually meaningful in a not such a great way. So we repurposed the whole idea of Columbus around discovery. And what this building does is weave into a tapestry of brick on the outside these windows into another world. And in particular, talking about the winds of discovery. On each of the primary facades, there is north, south, east, and west, and you can see the south up there, and this is the east wind. There are 80 named winds on the planet. So there was an opportunity for the students, and I think this is really the only school that I know of where all the students know where east is. This is a really important thing. Does anyone know where east is in this room right now? The sun's coming through the window right back there. We're dislocated most of the time, obviously right now inside with blinds down. The sun is coming in from over there, so we have an idea that the east side's over there, and west side's over there. East is that way and west is that way. There you go. And north is south. That's right. So the sun is coming up over there. Thank you very much. Only the Sicilians would know this. People from Italy. And he lives 2 blocks away. How important is it to know where we are? Well, I would argue very important. And having that connectivity to where we are on the planet, for children in particular, brings them into a relationship of a community that's larger than themselves. And I think that, to a certain extent, any creative endeavor is trying to do that. And you can see that in the south wind again, and in the west wind. What we're trying to do is integrate this into the way in which the architecture is made as well. You'll see that there are repeated patterns in here. All of them are based upon the 8x8 or 2.5x8 brick module. So this patterning is all connected to how the building is made. And I was talking with Tony earlier about architecture that was made hundreds of years ago. And it had an inherent coherence to it because of how it was made. And to a certain extent, that coherence is lost in a day and age when all sorts of materials are put together. And we're trying to find that coherence again and link our buildings not only to the way they're made, but what they're expressing. And in this particular school, taking the pediment that's traditional to classical architecture and bending it, and then putting the frieze all the way around of dancing figures instead of ones that are in togas. So it is recalling traditional architecture quite obviously, but at the same time is trying to enliven it in a different way. And these figures, which were cut out of aluminum and then placed from one location to another. And this caryatid that's at the front is kind of like magic revealed. There is clearly a column there, but it's inclined. And these forms that are put on that create a figure. And the intention here was to pull the children into the making of this figurative piece in a way that they could do it themselves. And indeed, a number of classes have done that year after year, remaking their own image of what a caryatid could be simply by putting together pieces that create a figure. This imagery has to do with both Gideon and the Pied Piper. They call it the Pied Piper. They've forgotten the Gideon part. The Gideon is calling the students into the school. The Pied Piper, if you remember, it's a rather chilling story. Got rid of all the mice in the town, but when he wasn't paid, he carried out all the children. So the notion here is that if the promise of education is not delivered, the children will leave. So it's a symbol both for the students and for the teachers. And they all know it, by the way. And the stories of that are told, the narratives in the previous buildings, are all known by the people within the buildings. And then finally, the University of Connecticut, where the sculpture is over the entire building. And the narrative is, in fact, going from one building, the building on the left, reading all the way across to the building on the right. And the facade is made up of figures that are embedded into language. So these figures are emerging from the building, which is educate is leading out literally into the light, isn't it? You know this better than I do. And these figures are kind of emerging out of the building itself into the letters. And these letters spell phrases that were chosen by the University of Connecticut. We're using 12 letters only in the 12 letters in the University of Connecticut. In this particular figure, you will see one of the most important elements of doing this sculpture, something that is lost in architecture and what we want to bring back. And that is the evidence of the human touch. The evidence of the human touch. And it is something that connects viscerally with all of us. You will see the lines that are on this particular sculpture. There was a young person who was helping me sculpt these, and she took her hand and raked them across the backgrounds of all these letters. How many different panels that we had, 19 or 20 different panels. And you can see that from hundreds of feet away. You can feel that sculpting. And that connectivity to who we are as human beings is extremely important to us. This is where we are literally a week ago, a project we're doing for Waterbury, Connecticut, where Timex Corporation is. There's a hand up there holding the Waterbury. Who knew before the Donald there was the Waterbury? A watch that had the fewest moving parts of any watch ever made at the time, and it was one of the most popular in the world. So that's where we are today. Behind all of this, and something that perhaps may be important and useful for you, are design guidelines that we have in the office. The design guidelines, by the way, the guidelines you can see up in the corner has an asterisk, and it's as per Dr. Venkman. Now, all of you know the work of Dr. Venkman. Who knows Dr. Venkman? Dr. Venkman, played by Bill Murray, was confronted by Sigourney Weaver. So now you remember who Dr. Venkman was. And Sigourney Weaver was speaking like Darth Vader. And he said, I make it a rule never to have sexual relations with anyone who's possessed. At which point, she grabs him, throws him on the bed. And he looks up and says, actually, it's more of a guideline. So these are guidelines. And these are ones we created ourselves over the last almost 20 years. And they change, and they're, as you can see, they're handwritten. And I would encourage all of you to come up with some guidelines that help you remember why it is you do what you do. Why it is, any aspect, whether it's you consider yourself creative or not, and I would maintain that all of you are. And let me just go through a couple of these. Don't Fight It, Feel It is one of my favorites. The great architectural historian Wilson Pickett said that on his first album, In the Midnight Hour. Very often we're wrestling with things and we just need to let it go and feel what it is. I don't need to explain that for those of you who have been in the creative process. One of my favorites too is Voltaire. Tous les styles vont bien, sauf les ennuyeux. All styles are fine except the boring ones. So we try not to be boring in our work. We want it to be exciting. We want it to be engaging, and obviously you do too. But it's incredible how the inexorable sweep of habit can make things less interesting. Here's a very important thing, that all of us are smarter than any one of us. There's a myth that we carry in our society of the sole genius, or the sole experimenter, or the sole designer. We know, any of us in the creative, any creative endeavor, know that it is actually a group endeavor. Sure, they're individual ideas, and we need to learn how to play together, obviously, a lot better. Value of the lines that make no sense. I remember I was doing a project where I was shading, there were these large sculptures, and I was shading the outside of the calf and the arm, all the things that would get shadow, everything logically. And one of the other collaborators in my office came through and said, no, man, just put on lines wherever you want it. And he came through and he just sort of drew all over the thing. And I went, oh my God, you're going to ruin the goddamn thing. It brought it alive. And he said, you got to pay attention to the lines that make no sense. It's extraordinary how important that has been to us. You're never as bold as you think. Sometimes you're a little too bold, but most of the time, at least for architects, we tend to be conservative because we have clients. Maybe you in the fashion industry don't feel that way. Mistakes are creativity's last shot at spontaneity. If we can believe the film on Jackson Pollock with Ed Harris, he's there working away on the paintings that didn't go anywhere, and he's spilling some of the paint while he's going like this, and he looks over, and he starts looking at the drips. We all know where that one went. So, you know, value the drips, too. That's probably important. And here's a key one in our office. How we are is what it becomes. This is an iconic Pogo cartoon. Yep, son, we have met the enemy, and it is us. We are our own worst critics. We also, when we come to the party, very often we're not all there. So I'm going to leave you with 3 takeaways, so to speak. Woody Allen, the great humorist and pedophile, said 80% of success is just showing up. So show up. You've all shown up. There is another 20%. It's how you show up, of course. We so often don't bring those talents, don't bring ourselves to the party enough. Fear is a huge one. We can see, this is how I felt when I got up this morning on the right, on the left. But I remembered Wilson Pickett, and I thought, gee, if I only had a red suit, you know, that would be great. And we can see the difference here. This is going on in us all the time. It's happening right now, right? Wilson Pickett is way back there probably right at the moment. You know, this guy's probably more there. Very important to remember this and to encourage others, because once you start encouraging others, then something can possibly happen. Now, these are great outfits. Play, and play with others. These guys are actually seriously playing, but the Aborigines are an extraordinary culture. A friend of mine who's an anthropologist told this story, that he had developed an intelligence test that could cut across all social and cultural barriers. And it was a test that you put things together. They got 10 people from this Aborigine tribe, and they put these piles of blocks together, explained to them very carefully. They had to put them together as quickly as possible, and they were going to time it, and the person who did it quickest would be the smartest. And they started the clock. All 10 of them went down to the first pile of blocks. Put it together like that, went down the whole row. is that not an extraordinarily different way of thinking about working together? I mean, can you imagine that? Well, we're clearly at the other end of the spectrum. If you can get even slightly towards that sense of including others and recognizing the talents of others, really anything is impossible. We work at this all the time in our office, and it is very difficult. We understand that. So one of the things that we try to do as often as possible is celebrate. And I'm not sure whether all of you are willing to celebrate right now, but when we were in Sioux City, Iowa, building our very first house, we were quite excited about it. So every time we put up a wall, which we called this ceremonial erection, we didn't realize how important that would become later on in life, but so every time we put up a wall, we would have this cheer. We developed this cheer. Abstract Construction Enterprises, of course, has the 3 letters, ACE, that make a very easy thing to remember, ACE. And so we had this cheer, very simple. It went ACE, 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 rah, 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 ACE, 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 hey. But the really important part, the really great part of this, is right at the very end, you say hey, and then you just go like this, silently, back and forth, just like that. Really great cheer. Are you ready? Are you ready? Okay. We can do this, honey. You got this? The hands up like this? Everybody, the hands up. Usually I make everybody get up. You know, usually you have to stand up. Are you ready here? But remember, the last part is really good. You have to go to the right and then the left, but straight ahead like this. Like this. Okay, ready? Ace, ace, ace. Yeah, great. Thank you. Well done. Thank you.